Hello everyone, welcome to Achievers IAS classes. Let's begin a discussion on the part 4 of the yearly roundup where we'll look into some of the most important events from the months of October, November and December of the previous year. So let's begin with the hashtag #MeToo campaign. The hashtag #MeToo campaign on social media is going on with women from different sectors, particularly working in the media and entertainment industry, has spoke about the sexual harassment they face at workplace. Following this, the center has recently announced that it would set up a panel of judges to look into the legal framework to curb sexual harassment at workplaces. The Sexual Harassment at Workplace Bill, which was formulated based on the Vaishaka guidelines, had put in place an internal complaints committee to look into issues of sexual harassment at workplace. But the Verma committee, which was set up in 2013, had proposed forming an employment tribunal to receive and adjudicate all complaints to ensure speedy disposal and justice for the victims. Further, the report had noted that the tribunal should not function as a civil court but may choose its own procedure to deal with each complaint on a case by case basis. The tribunal should be appointed by a collegium headed by the Chief Justice of the concerned High Court and should comprise of two retired judges, with at least one of them being a woman, two eminent sociologists, and one social activist who has experience in the field of gender-based discrimination. Further, the report noted that the Internal Complaint Committee would be counterproductive as dealing with such complaints in-house could discourage women from filing complaints. Therefore, the committee had proposed forming an employment tribunal and had said that an employer could be held liable if he or she had facilitated sexual harassment or permitted an environment where sexual misconduct becomes widespread and systemic. In such a case, the company would be liable to pay compensation to the complainant if found to be guilty. The panel also made several suggestions to encourage women to come forward and file complaints. Like, for instance, it opposed penalizing women for false complaints and also said that the time limit of 3 months to file a complaint should be done away with. On that note, let's move on to the next issue, which is the recent verdict of the Delhi High Court, which sentenced members of the Uttar Pradesh Provincial Armed Constabulary to life imprisonment for the massacre of Muslims, which was committed 31 years before following a communal riot in the region. The High Court has concluded that these killings were custodial deaths as well as targeted killings of people from a particular community. The whole incident took place after the brother of an army officer was killed in communal violence and the Provincial Armed Constabulary of Uttar Pradesh abducted about 45 Muslim men, most of them who were shot and thrown into two canals. Therefore, the recent verdict not only highlights the delay in the judicial system but also highlights the justice system responding to fix the accountability and thereby deliver justice to the affected families. It is also a reminder that there is a constant need for reassuring that policing and criminal justice system in the country will remain free from any prejudice towards any community. On that note, let's move on to the next issue. In a similar news item, let's see the conviction of 70 persons in the Anti-Sikh riots case of 1984. The Delhi High Court has recently upheld the conviction of 70 persons on the charges of rioting, burning houses, and violating curfew in the National Capital Region during the riots which took place after the assassination of former Prime Minister Srimati Indira Gandhi. The High Court has also made several observations and suggestions by noting that the general criminal law is ill-equipped to deal with such communal rights cases, thereby suggesting several reforms. Some of these include the possibility of entrusting the investigative and prosecution procedures to authorities other than the normal state agencies in order to maintain neutrality in the process. This is because the court has observed various kinds of allegations of political influence in the investigative and prosecution process of the state agencies. Further, the court has suggested amendments to the Commission of Inquiries Act, the Prosecution of Human Rights Act, in order to entrust the responsibility of investigation of communal riots to the special investigation teams formed under these legislations. Also, highlighting the technological advancements, particularly in the print and electronic media, the High Court has said that the photographic material and video footages could be used as evidence during the trial of such criminal cases. Now let's move on to the next issue regarding the growing menace of antibiotic resistance. There are three major sources of antibiotic resistance, namely the overuse of antibiotics by human beings, the overuse in veterinary sector, and antibiotic contamination due to pharmaceutical and hospital discharge. With respect to antibiotic overuse in the veterinary sector, a recent investigation has found that the world's largest veterinary drug maker, Zetis, has been selling antibiotics as growth promoters to poultry farmers in India, even though it had stopped the practice in the US given the ban in early 2017. India is yet to regulate antibiotic use in the poultry sector. Therefore, the drug maker is not liable for his actions in India. This is worrisome because India has the highest burden of infectious diseases and will suffer the most due to drug resistance. The government has taken certain steps, like for instance, to reduce the overuse of antibiotics by human beings. India has classified important antibiotics under Schedule H1 of the Drugs and Cosmetic Rules so that they couldn't be sold without prescriptions. However, these drugs still continue to be freely available in pharmacies with the state drug controllers unable to enforce the law in true spirit. On the overuse of antibiotics in the veterinary sector, no progress has been made, thereby allowing companies to sell last resort drugs to farmers, thereby leading to growing drug resistance. And finally, on the discharge of medical waste, India is yet to introduce standards for antibiotics in wastewater, and due to lack of such monitoring, there is an explosion in resistance genes in these water bodies, thereby requiring urgent steps by the government on all three fronts. Given the high stakes involved, the government cannot neglect the issue but has to take immediate steps in order to prevent drug resistance. The next issue, which was in news, is the recent tragic death of an American in the North Sentinel Island in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. This has led to a debate between convicting and punishing the tribals and integrating them into the modern society, both of which are misguided because Sentinelese are one of the particularly vulnerable tribal groups identified by the central government based on their primitive means of existence. The attempt made by the American man to contact these tribal groups is foolhardy and dangerous because no one is allowed to venture into the northern Sentinel Island without permission and elaborate precautions because these tribal community have lived in isolation and various degrees of protection are in place in order to safeguard them. Also, the Sentinelese have no immunity or resistance to even the commonest of infections, thereby requiring such higher degrees of protection. In this regard, the government follows an hands-off policy to ensure that no poachers enter the island, and also there is a protocol of circumnavigating the island as well as a buffer has been maintained so that this community is not disturbed. Given this background and the fact that the 2011 census has recorded a population number of just 15 of this tribal community, the American has knowingly broke the law, which have led to the misguided debates of punishing the tribals for his misadventure. The topic is of course important for students with anthropology optional, but also a situation-based question can be expected even for other candidates in the interview. On that note, let's move on to the next issue, which is regarding the Witness Protection Scheme, which was recently put in place by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has asked the state governments to implement a scheme framed by the center to protect witnesses during criminal trials from threat, intimidation, and undue influence. The need for such a scheme has been emphasized by various law commission reports and court judgments over the years, and also the fact that witnesses turning hostile is a major reason for most acquittals and the abysmal rate of convictions in the country. This is because currently there is little incentive for the witnesses to testify against criminals, and also they have to face various threats, hostility, and harassment while attending courts. Also, given the huge backlog and the tardy judicial process, the efforts made by the witnesses are often ignored, thereby making a case for a robust witness protection program. In this regard, the recent step by the Supreme Court is a welcome move, and the central government too deserves credit for coming forward to suggest that its draft witness protection scheme should be introduced by judicial mandate instead of waiting for a formal legislation by the parliament. As per the system put in place by the Supreme Court, witnesses who are in need of protection will be classified under three types based on their threat assessment by a competent authority, and the witness protection scheme is to be funded by budgetary support from state governments and donations. This, however, is at variance with the Law Commission's recommendation that the state and central governments should equally share the cost of implementation of this scheme. Further, on the implementation side of the scheme, basic features such as camera trial, anonymization of testimony may not be difficult to implement, but the advanced forms of identity protection, like giving witnesses a new identity, address, and even parentage with matching documents without undermining their professional and property rights, would be a major challenge, and concealing the identity of witnesses and expanding the facilities needed for such infrastructure to be put in place poses both logistical and financial challenges, but the program is well worth of the effort as it would help strengthen the criminal justice system of our country. On that note, let's move on to the next issue regarding the Global Hunger Index released by the IFPRA. India has been ranked at 103rd position out of 119 countries in the index, with hunger levels in the country categorized as serious. As per the report, at least 1 in 5 Indian children under the age of 5 years are wasted, which means they have extremely low weight for their height. This reflects acute undernutrition as per the Global Hunger Index. The only country with a higher prevalence of child wasting is South Sudan, and India has also dropped 3 places from its position last year. The 4 main indicators which are used to calculate the hunger levels in the report are undernourishment, which is the share of the population which is undernourished and reflects insufficient caloric intake, and the other 3 indicators used are data for children under 5 years, namely child wasting, child stunting, and child mortality. In these indicators, while the percentage of undernourished people and child mortality has reduced, the prevalence of child wasting has actually worsened not only in India but also remains high across South Asia. Further, the report notes that wasting rates are highest for infants aged between 0 and 5 months, suggesting that attention to birth outcomes and breastfeeding is important. Also, child wasting in the region is associated with low maternal body mass index, suggesting that there has to be increased focus on the nutritional status of women during pregnancy. The next issue is regarding India's energy security. Indian economy has been facing multiple external headwinds like the widening current account deficit, the sliding rupee value, the rising prices of crude oil, all of which could negatively affect the prospects of Indian economy, thereby making it necessary for India to diversify its energy basket. At the recently concluded India Energy Forum, Prime Minister Narendra Modi urged the oil producing countries to reduce the cost of energy in order to aid the global economy in recovering, and also called for a review of payment terms demanding the partial use of rupee instead of the US dollar. This is because India imports over 80% of its oil demand, and in the recent times, oil prices have risen by as much as 70% in rupee terms in the last 1 year. Given that Saudi Arabia, which is one of the prominent suppliers of crude oil to India, has refused to openly commit to lowering the oil prices, the actions needed by the government include reduction in the central and state taxes, which is unlikely given the government's fiscal needs. Apart from this, in the long term, the government has to tap into domestic sources of energy while simultaneously encouraging consumers to switch to green alternatives to reduce crude oil consumption. This will require a stronger policy framework and effective implementation. And also, in the short term, the government could also look at diversifying its supplier base to manage any unplanned shocks. Further, the government should also factor in geopolitical risks, such as in the case of Iran, in meeting its energy requirements. Therefore, the energy policy has to be long term and has to be holistic in order to address the energy requirements of a growing economy like India. On that note, let's move on to the next issue regarding the revised GDP data. Newly released GDP back series has revised the growth rate of the previous years, thereby questioning the claim of the previous government of a high growth rate during its tenure. Such backcasting is a regular exercise that governments carry out in order to enable a precise comparison and analysis of the economic growth, which involves the inclusion of newer data sources, exclusion of outdated ones, as well as making certain subjective assumptions in the whole process. Given this, and also the change in methodology and the base year for the calculation of GDP, the back series data computed by the Central Statistics Office has now shown that the nation never grew in double digits in the year 2010-11, nor was it a high growth economy in the previous years as was claimed earlier. Further, it also shows that the Indian economy never really decoupled from the global financial crisis of 2008, which is reflected in a much lower growth rate as per the new numbers. The key takeaway from the whole exercise is that even though the method of computation reflects the latest United Nations system of national accounts, the policymakers should be aware that the data generated and the methods used has been thoroughly scrutinized by experts, including the past chief statisticians and the advisory committee on national account statistics. In this regard, India needs to invest more in data collection and integration, and more so with respect to the informal sector, and at the same time prevent the politicization of the issue. On that note, let's move on to the next issue, which is regarding the direct tax base of the country. The union government has taken various steps to widen its tax base, which is reflected in the rise in direct tax to GDP ratio, the average income reported by individuals and corporate taxpayers, and also the tax buoyancy factor. The rise in tax compliance can be attributed to several measures like the better gathering of information about the sources of incomes of individuals, the ease of getting refunds, and the lowering of various tax compliance costs. As a result, the total direct tax collection has seen an increase of 18% over the previous year. This widening of the tax base is good news, but the contribution of direct taxes to the total amount of taxes collected by the government still stands at 52%, and also the share of direct taxes has fallen every single year since 2013-14 except for the current fiscal year, which essentially means the rise in the total tax collection in the last few years has come from the indirect tax collections, which are considered to be regressive. Also, direct taxes are preferable from the standpoint of economic efficiency and also help in avoiding the severe distortionary effects of indirect taxes such as the goods and service tax. Further, given the increasing global tax competition, India is likely to face competition from other countries to bring down the corporate tax rates in order to maintain its attractiveness as a profitable investment destination. In this regard, the efforts made to draft a new direct tax code are stuck due to bureaucratic delays, which has to be addressed in order to increase the share of the direct taxes in the total tax collection. The next important issue was regarding the financial crisis in the NBFC sector. The recent default of the infrastructure leasing and financial services over its various debt obligations has raised serious questions about the functioning of the regulators and has also exposed the underlying weakness in the non-banking financial company sector, which has depended heavily on low-cost, short-term debt financing, which is not a sustainable business model. Because at a time when both international and domestic interest rates continue to rise, these NBFCs have come under pressure and their profit margins have reduced due to the rise in borrowing costs. NBFCs were seen as an alternative to traditional banking in certain sectors because the commercial banks were troubled with raising NPAs. However, the recent liquidity crisis in the NBFC sector has raised serious questions on the NBFC model of financing. While the government has decided to replace the management of the defaulting company, the banking sector, namely the RBI, the National Housing Bank, and the State Bank of India, have decided to increase the supply of liquidity in order to keep the interest rates under control. While offering such easy money may be a welcome measure to ease the liquidity crisis, but the prolonged supply of low cost funds to the NBFC sector creates the risk of building an unsustainable bubble of debt in various sectors of the economy, and any eventual state bailouts could fuel a moral hazard as other financial institutions may also expect a similar measure if they were to default in future. Therefore, policymakers should focus on taking steps to address the structural problems which contributed to the crisis, like widening the borrower base of the NBFCs, which, as you know, have been banned from accepting deposits from customers. By allowing NBFCs to accept deposits, these institutions can tap into more reliable sources of funding and also avoid any liquidity crisis in the future.
The next issue in news is an editorial about the challenge of global warming and the measures needed to mitigate its harmful effects. The Paris Climate Agreement, which was endorsed by 195 countries under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, is to be implemented through a rule book which was recently negotiated at the UN Climate Conference held in Poland. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change had recently, in a special report, had issued a stark warning on man-made emissions and had said that in order to cap the rise in global average temperature over the pre-industrial levels at 1.5 degrees Celsius, it is necessary to reduce the emissions by 45% from the 2010 levels by the year 2030. This is a challenge for all the big economies, including India, which is among the top 5 emitters of the carbon dioxide. Even though India emits far below than the global average of 4.2 tons, the prospect of increased frequency and intensity of extreme weather events and sea level rise cannot be ignored, thereby highlighting the need for action on several fronts, like scaling up the solar and wind energy, steadily reducing the dependence on coal, shifting towards electric mobility, and adopting green industrial processes. Also, there has to be a paradigm shift that will slow down the addition of new sources of carbon emissions, and India has to systematically assess its various sources of emissions and measure the mitigation actions for reporting to the UNFCCC. This provides us an opportunity to bring major sectors such as energy production, building, agriculture, and transport by making regulations that favor environment-friendly alternatives. In this regard, although China has taken the lead in advancing electric mobility, like the individual states and cities of the USA, a Clean Up India will help meet emission commitments and remove the blanket of air pollution that is suffocating several cities.
Now let's look into some of the important international news, starting with the political crisis in Sri Lanka. The Sri Lankan president had used his constitutional powers questionably and removed Mr. Ranil Wickremesinghe as the country's prime minister and reinstalled Mahinda Rajapaksa as the prime minister, even though he failed to prove his majority in the parliament. These ill-advised moves of the Sri Lankan president were struck down by the Supreme Court of Sri Lanka, restrained Mr. Rajapaksa from functioning, and also reinstated the legislature which was dissolved by the President Mr. Maithripala Sirisena. The ruling has significantly affected the President's credibility by categorically stating that the dissolution of the Sri Lankan Parliament was illegal and void, and rejected the President's claim that it is his right to dissolve the Parliament at any time. The governance vacuum and the absence of clarity on whether there was a legitimate government in Sri Lanka had left various countries and multilateral financial institutions in a confusion with respect to the official dealings. In this regard, the court has upheld the constitutional provisions of Sri Lanka by reinstating the dissolved legislature and the ousted prime minister, which is seen as the first step in resolving the constitutional crisis in the country. The final issue we will discuss is
the recent release of Mr. Hamid Nihal Ansari, who was sentenced to 3 years in prison by the Pakistani authorities on charges of espionage. In this regard, the Ministry of External Affairs has to be credited for its sustained diplomatic pressure for a fair trial and consular access, and also the government of Pakistan must also be commended for Mr. Ansari's release. Above all, the citizens group in both the countries, particularly the lawyers and human rights activists who worked to ensure Mr. Ansari's release, deserve credit. This is because, given the downturn in bilateral relations between India and Pakistan, and previous experience like the conviction of Kulbhushan Jadhav, instances of prisoners like Sarabjit Singh who died in the Pakistani jail, it is nothing short of a miracle that Mr. Ansari has been released and has returned home. Going forward, the two countries should adopt a more humane approach to each other prisoners and dedicate themselves to freeing hundreds of other prisoners, among whom are a large number of fishermen who have unknowingly trespassed into each other's waters. In this regard, the two countries must revive the biannual meetings of the Joint Judicial Committee on Prisoners, which has not met since 2013, and must also consider its recommendations that women, children, as well as prisoners with mental health issues should be sent back to their home countries on humanitarian grounds. This is because there is little to be gained by holding these prisoners hostage to the bitter bilateral ties, and a more humane approach is needed to end the misery of their impoverished families.
On that note, I'm wrapping up today's news analysis. Do like, share, and comment to support this initiative. Thank you for watching. Have a nice day.